This is the Real News Network. I'm Lynn Fries in Geneva. Here in Geneva at the book launch for the Handbook of Alternative Theories of Economic Development, the comment was made that what this book is telling us is that right now, when everybody in the world is recognizing things are not quite all right, we need to actually look at things differently and do things differently. There's a rich tradition of alternative thinking, and there are insights available to us that we should look at. This program features that discussion, specifically comments made by a panel moderated by book co-editor Jayati Ghosh of Jawaharlal Nehru University. We now go inside this book event at the UN Library as Jayati Ghosh opens that discussion.
We actually think that this book, well, it was a long time in the making. It took about 3 or 4 years to actually get all of this together. But we think it's come out at a propitious time. Our main editor, Eric Reinert, he couldn't be here today, unfortunately, but he has a theory that we are living in what he calls an 1848 moment. 1848 in Europe was the year of revolutions. It was the year that the Communist Manifesto was written. It was the year when the established order came under attack from left and right. Eric Reinert talks about how there was a very right-wing person who kind of, broke the barriers, talked about how free trade, etc., was actually antithetical to the sane society. And he was so right-wing, Hildebrand, he had to move to Switzerland. Karl Marx, as you know, was too left-wing, he had to move to England. But John Stuart Mill, who was in fact the big votary of free trade, recanted in 1848. He talks about how, in fact, free trade, there are many concerns with how it is operating, and we have to think about what it actually does for the processes of growth and development. Of course, all of them saw themselves as talking about development. And in a sense, that's what we want to bring back. The notion that development economics is not something separate. There's real economics and then there's development economics. That's not true. All major thinkers about the economy were development economists because that's what they saw the economy as doing. In a sense, going through transformations, structural changes, different kinds of evolution, and that is what they studied. So in this book, it's a very big fat book, as you can see. There are 40 articles, 50 contributors, but the reason is because we've tried to bring in as many different ways of looking at different realities as possible. And in the process, we've tried to get away from some of these standard, shall we say, mistakes that often happen on perspectives on looking at the process of economic development. First of all, the notion that the physiocrats were the origin of economic thinking, and after the physiocrats came Smith and so on and so forth. This book shows that there was a wealth of fascinating economic theory which is still relevant in the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe, but in fact also in China, in the Tang dynasty, in India, in the 2nd and 4th century BC, and so on and so forth. So, there was a wealth of very, very interesting, relevant discussion on economic development in the history of economic thought. We try to get away from a very Anglo-Saxon and Northern European, North Atlantic approach to development, which, as you know, is a big problem in social sciences generally. Also, we have essentially tried to move away from a static notion of development, a notion that there is a particular problem, that poverty is a problem that you can deal with by going and doing a particular policy, and that will actually change. In a sense, we are trying to rescue development economics from what we feel is a kind of trap it has fallen into, where it's gone from looking at macro processes to micro interventions and to micro aspects, so that you're no longer looking at economic development as a broad evolutionary process that has winners and losers in a way that can actually be altered through negotiation, contestation, struggle, and change. But you're looking at poverty alleviation and how to do it. And then, of course, the development industry, we all know, tends to generate different kinds of silver bullets that would then solve the problem of poverty. inequality. I think the contributions in this book take a much more complex view. There are contributions from many, many different countries from all the major continents. There are historical, analytical, and contemporary contributions. But I think what's important is that it's telling us that right now, when everybody in the world is recognizing that things are not quite all right, we need to actually look at things differently and do things differently. There's a rich tradition of that, and there are insights available to us that we should actually look at. So I'm going to begin by asking Rainer Kattel, who is one of the editors of this volume. Rainer is currently, he's a professor at Tallinn University of Technology in Estonia, and he's also a visiting professor at University College London. I think Rainer has some very interesting insights, not just about industrialization and development, but about deindustrializing, coming from Eastern Europe, and what that does to development. And in particular, how the wheels of history can change in very different ways, sometimes really bad. We've been through a lot of the bad recently, and sometimes in a positive direction. So Rainer, can I ask you a little bit about those?
Yeah, I think one of the first things in the context of the book, to look at it is actually when we started it, discussion with Elgar was probably 5 years ago, and if you look at it now, the political context has really radically changed, and both for the worse and for the better in that sense. If you look what happens in the United States, of course it has become much worse for the orthodox ideas and the orthodox thinking. But also there are, of course, countries where the political change is quite different. And even in my own country, Estonia, where I come from, we were, for 25 years, I think, one of the most neoliberal countries in Europe. So we were in number one in economic growth, but also number one in Gini index. And so we had this sort of embodied the neoliberal good and the bad. And of course, also our ideas had actually very difficult traction, but since last October, we have a prime minister who used to be my student. So things actually can change to a positive. So people who have been educated in orthodox ideas can also come to power. And of course, the same what we see happening now in UK, where Jeremy Corbyn all of a sudden has become a youth idol, and he's being sung at Glastonbury Festival, which is the last thing you would think of as a political event. But still, so there is a political sea change going on. And I think what the book really tries to address is to show sort of the key fallacies of the last perhaps 20 years in development thinking. And I think they all center around sort of the basic idea that economics as a science and the economy as an activity and technology and innovation are somehow value-free, that they do not create moral or social values, that they are apolitical in that sense. They are what they are. They're like physics. You just need to do it well, you need to do it right, and you get development. But of course, that's what orthodox economics can do very well, to show this is blatantly not true. I mean, it's not true historically, and it's also not true in terms of theory and other frameworks and concepts. So if you look at financial innovations, obviously there are innovations that are very, very harmful to the society, to the social good. And the same thing if you look, for instance, around idea of inequality, dislocation of people, all of these processes. There are economic processes, especially technological processes, can also be very, very harmful. And so there is always, obviously, a need to understand economy, or economics as a political economy, as a moral science, as it were. And I think this is what the volume really shows, that there's a wealth of, there's not only one way of doing economics as a moral science, if you will, but there has been in history, and even today, multiple of ways of doing that. And that's perhaps where this volume has become particularly, I think, timely, is to show, exactly for these new political movements, that there is not only one way of doing, I don't know, 1970s social democracy, but you can also do very different ways of orthodox new economic policies that are perhaps much more inclusive and actually oriented towards sort of public purpose and public good than the economic orthodoxy. So in that sense, I think this is really what the book shows. But I think for the political movements and also for our discussion, I think what is really the key issue is how do you break what the great John Galbraith called bureaucratic symbiosis. I mean, he saw the symbiotic relationship between big business and government is that they both sort of serve the same master, which is themselves basically, and really don't care about public purpose and public value and all of those issues. And I think this really has become probably the most interesting issue for our times, is how do you break the power of big business and their collusion with government, for instance. What has now become the key in international trade is, of course, data. The data has become so dominantly important, but data is basically owned by 5 companies. All of them are American companies. So how do you sort of break this kind of hold of these companies over the sort of the economic hold of our times, and how do you also make the governments actually not to sort of collude with them? Of course, I think today only the European Commission fined Google for 2.4 billion euros for not following the rules. So I think there is a way to do that. But I think that we need to really find ways how this becomes more a grassroots movement rather than just sort of a movement in courts. And so I think this is what our volume really tries to sort of highlight, is these various options and various ways to do that. So but I will stop here as a brief intro.
We're going to break and be back with part 2 of this program. Special thanks to the panelist and moderator of this discussion and the UN Library, Geneva, as host of this book launch for the Handbook of Alternative Theories of Economic Development. And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.